My town exiled one family a year to maintain our perfect reputation. That sentence was the iron rule, the quiet, terrifying foundation everything else was built on. It was a rule we all lived by, whispered about in dark corners but never challenged out loud. I was 13 years old when the system first carved itself into my mind, leaving a scar that never quite faded. It was the year my best friend's family was chosen. His name was Ben, and we had spent every summer since kindergarten building forts in the creek behind his house. The town hall felt too large and too bright that evening, choked with forced smiles and a collective, nervous silence. Every family had cast their anonymous ballot for who should leave. When the council leader, a man whose face was set in granite, finally called the name, Ben's mother made a sound like something vital breaking inside her chest. "Please," she begged, stumbling forward. "We've lived here for 3 generations. We've always paid our taxes. We've done everything right." The council leader didn't flinch. He just shook his head slowly. "The vote has been cast, Mrs. Henderson. You have 24 hours to leave. Anyone caught helping you pack or say goodbye will join you." The air thickened, and I watched, horrified, as Ben's entire family became untouchable. Neighbors who had shared holidays with them for decades instinctively took 3 steps back, as if contagion might leap across the polished wood floor. They were allowed to take nothing except the clothes they could carry. Their house, their cars, their savings. Everything became community property, liquidated into the general fund. The injustice felt medieval. The sheriff's department surrounded their home that evening, a visible, stark line drawn between the chosen and the safe. I watched from the darkened corner of my bedroom window as Ben loaded garbage bags of clothes into their dented, beat-up old van, the only vehicle the town permitted them to keep. He was crying, but silently, his face a mask of shocked numbness. He stopped, his eyes scanning the windows along the street. For a brief, horrible moment, his gaze locked onto my house. He raised a hand and gave a small, wary wave. I was paralyzed. I wanted to wave back, to signal that 5 years of friendship wasn't meaningless, but the fear was a physical chokehold around my throat. The council leader's threat echoed in my ears. "Anyone caught helping you pack or say goodbye will join you." My own safety and my family's depended on my cowardice. I ducked below the window, my heart slamming against my ribs, too scared to wave back at my best friend who was losing everything. That failure, that silent betrayal, became the root of a deep, persistent shame I would carry for years. That night, I couldn't stop shaking. I curled up beneath my covers and whispered the question that haunted every child in our town. What if we're chosen next? My father's response was curt, born of his own tightly controlled terror. "Then we leave with nothing," he said. "Now stop talking about it." For the next few years, the approach of the annual exile vote brought crippling panic attacks. The whole town would gather, a forced spectacle of democratic terror. They called it maintaining community standards, but everyone knew the real name was fear management. When I was 15, they chose the Hendersons, no relation to Ben's family, but the reason was just as arbitrary and cruel. Their son was caught smoking marijuana. Mr. Henderson begged on his knees, his face wet with tears. "It was just marijuana!" "He's a good kid. Drug use threatens our reputation," the council leader stated emotionless. "The vote stands." Mrs. Henderson had cancer and required specialized treatments only available at our local hospital. It made no difference. They were gone by morning. 2 weeks later, we heard she died in a charity ward 3 states away, stripped of her care by the town's desire for spotless appearances. The cost of our community's perfection was someone else's death. My older sister, Maya, fell in love with a boy named John, whose family ran the bakery downtown. They were planning their future together, college, marriage, their own small business. When the axe fell again, John's father had been caught gambling online, a moral failure that could infect others. The town council, always seeking targets of opportunity, had found their justification. John begged Maya in front of everyone, "Please, come with me." But voluntary exile meant you could never return, never inherit anything, never contact anyone again. Maya couldn't choose that. She just stood there, crying, a silent, terrible breakdown, as the deputies dragged John and his family away. Maya never recovered. She stopped eating, stopped talking, and simply stared at the wall until my parents, afraid of what she might do, were forced to send her to a mental health facility outside of town. The exile system hadn't just removed a family, it had destroyed ours from the inside out. By the time I turned 17, the constant fear had solidified into a cold, focused anger. I stopped having panic attacks and started paying closer attention. I used my fear not as a paralysis but as a lens. I began tracking the exiled families, noting their businesses, their connections, their alleged crimes. The pattern was slow to emerge, but once I saw it, it was impossible to unsee. The 5 founding families, the Nelsons, the Davidsons, the Hollands, the Smiths and the Carters, who owned the major businesses, sat on the council, and controlled the town, never got chosen. Never. In 50 years of the exile vote, not one member of those 5 families had been forced out. How do they never get voted out? I whispered to my mother one afternoon in the safety of our kitchen. Her face went pale, exactly as my father's had years before. "Wayne, stop asking questions! We don't talk about this!" But I couldn't stop. I kept watching. The council collected the ballots in a heavy wooden box only they could access. They counted the votes in private behind locked doors. They announced the results with no verification, no oversight, and no appeal. The awful clarity of the truth hit me then. It wasn't a vote. It was a selection disguised as democracy, a mechanism of social and economic control. The system wasn't arbitrary. It was perfectly rigged to remove competitors and threats. 3 months later, I got my answer for why they were immune. My father, a dedicated engineer at the town factory, was promoted to supervisor, leapfrogging the son of a founding family member who was demonstrably less qualified. We were competition now. We had threatened their power. That year, my father's face was the one plastered on the screens. When the council leader called our name, my mother collapsed onto the polished wood floor. "We've done everything right," she choked out, grasping at the council leader's immaculate trouser leg. "We've never caused trouble." The man smiled, cold and remote. "The community has spoken, Mr. Davies. You have 24 hours to leave." Wayne's obsessive tracking of the exile system had become his private religion, demanding an answer to the question that had gnawed at him since he was 13. How do they never get voted out? The terror of the town wasn't just the annual uncertainty. It was the unspoken understanding that the rules only applied to 99% of the population. The 1% who sat in the council chairs, who owned the factory where my father worked and the land the town sat on, were untouchable. I spent months confirming what I already knew in my gut. I cross-referenced the names called over the last 20 years with public records of town asset ownership and council membership. The Hendersons, the factory worker who was exiled for reporting safety violations. The owner of the small hardware store whose business had started to compete with the Carter family's timber company. They were all threats, not criminals. Their alleged moral failures, or community standard violations, were simply flimsy justifications for eliminating competition. I realized then that the system was not simply broken. It was operating exactly as it was designed to. It was an elegant machine of economic control, masked by the civic theater of anonymous voting. The council didn't eliminate the worst among us. They eliminated the successful, the ambitious, or the inconvenient. 3 days before the last exile vote that I would ever witness from the safe side of the window, I stood in the town hall watching the council leader place the heavy, locked wooden ballot box on the table. Only he and the 4 other founding family members had the keys. No one saw the votes counted. They simply emerged from the locked back room an hour later, triumphant and grave, to announce the year's victim. The truth was a cold, sharp dread that settled in my stomach. I looked at the 5 men and saw not community leaders, but predators. I had always been afraid of the system, but now I was afraid of them, the specific people who wielded it. My quiet query to my mother, "How do they never get voted out?" had been met with the most violent panic I'd ever seen from her. Her eyes widened, instantly filling with terror. She grabbed my arm with a strength I didn't know she possessed. "Wayne, listen to me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Stop asking questions. Stop thinking about it. That is how we stay safe." Her fear confirmed the corruption. She knew too. Everyone knew, but they chose as her willful ignorance. They chose a fearful, shallow peace over the dangerous truth. And that choice, that complicity, was what made the town's perfection possible. The internal conflict I carried, the deep, hot shame of hiding from Ben's wave, intensified. My cowardice at 13 had been passive, born of immediate, blinding fear. The cowardice of the adults in town was thus active, a deliberate turning away from injustice to protect their comfortable lives, which was worse. I didn't know, but the knowledge made me feel desperately alone. The realization that my family was in mortal danger didn't come with a flash of insight, but with a slow, creeping certainty, like watching a bruise bloom under the skin. It started with my father's promotion. He had worked at the manufacturing plant for 15 years, earned 3 safety awards, and was undeniably the best person for the supervisor position. But the job was handed down to a founding family member's son, a kid fresh out of trade school who had none of my father's experience. When the factory manager announced my father's promotion, a full, formal elevation to supervisor, the air in our house felt heavy, not with celebration, but with foreboding. My father was elated, a flicker of his old, confident self returning. He spoke of new opportunities and maybe finally affording to get Maya the better care she needed. But I could only see the target now painted on our backs. His merit, his honesty, his competence. These were not virtues in our town, they were us threats. His merit, his honesty, his competence. These were not virtues in our town, they were us threats. Now, every decision he made at the factory put us on the council's radar, moving us closer to the center of the crosshairs. The council leader's son, the one who had been passed over, was a Carter. The Carters owned the factory. The promotion was an act of insubordination against the established order, a breach of the unwritten contract of power. We were no longer simply residents striving for perfection. We were now competition. We had challenged their control. My fear shifted from the existential terror of a random vote to the cold dread of targeted assassination. Every time the phone rang, every time a black sedan passed our house, my throat would seize up. I didn't need the vote to know what was coming. The pattern was complete. I was powerless, knowing the truth, but unable to warn my father without sounding paranoid, unable to act because any action would confirm their suspicion. The shame of my past inaction was now compounded by the paralysis of my present knowledge. 3 months after the promotion, the night before the next vote, the factory manager pulled my father aside. I didn't hear the conversation, but I saw my father's face when he walked in the door at 7:30 that evening. It was the face of a man who had seen his own name written on a tombstone. When the official notice arrived the next morning, confirming our family's impending exile, my mother, who had maintained a facade of nervous control for years, collapsed instantly. The sheet of paper fluttered to the floor near her hand. She just lay there, sobbing into the wood, her whole body convulsing with the understanding that every lie, every compromise, every year of quiet obedience had been for nothing. The council leader's cold smile as he read our name confirmed the betrayal. There was no pretense of community standards. There was only the naked truth of power. We were being removed because my father had dared to be better than their son. As we began packing our lives into trash bags, the irony of losing everything to a system based on perfection was a cruel, sickening joke. I looked out the window. Neighbors peered from behind drawn curtains, not out of malice, but out of self-preservation. 20 years of shared dinners, borrowed tools, and friendly waves meant absolutely nothing now that we were contaminated. My girlfriend, Sarah, who I had planned to take to prom, walked past our house on the sidewalk and refused to meet my eye. Her silence cut deeper than the council leader's pronouncement. The town was built on fear, and in the end, fear always won. My mother's tears were relentless. My father sat on the worn couch, staring straight ahead, his hands hanging uselessly between his knees. Everything we had built was gone, not due to some moral failing, but because we had merely existed in the wrong place at the wrong time. We were handed the keys to the same beat-up van Ben's family had driven. The sheriff gave us just enough gas to reach the county line. "Don't come back," he said, his face a mask of official indifference. Ever. We drove away in silence, the van rattling and shaking beneath us. The only sound was the damp, exhausted crying of my mother and the heavy, terrible silence of my father, broken completely. I sat in the back, surrounded by the garbage bags of our clothes, feeling the crushing weight of utter, final despair. There was no money, no home, no future. We were just another family destroyed by the founding family's cold calculus of power. As we neared the county line, the white-painted stripe that marked the end of our world, I braced myself for the final, empty moment of isolation. But then, through the darkness, I saw something strange. A car was waiting, pulled over just past the line. Then another car, then a third, and then 10 more. Their headlights cutting through the late night air. They were all waiting for us. Just as the weight of everything threatened to crush us at the county line, the silence was broken by the sound of other engines. My father brought the van to a hesitant stop right on the county line, the old engine shuddering and dying. He stared through the windshield at the assembly of 10 or 15 vehicles, a ragged convoy of beat-up trucks, worn-out sedans and vans similar to our own. People stood outside them, waiting in the darkness. My mother stopped crying, her face buried in her hands, still vibrating with choked sobs. "What is it?" My mother whispered, her voice rough with grief. "Is it the sheriff coming back?" My father didn't answer. He was broken, but not stupid. He knew the sheriff wouldn't be waiting for us here. A man stepped forward from the line of cars and approached our van. He looked to be in his early 50s, with kind, tired eyes and a sturdy build. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt, his posture radiating authority, but not the cold manufactured kind we were used to. He tapped gently on the driver's window. My father slowly rolled it down, the action sounding painfully loud in the sudden silence. "Welcome, Davies family," the man said, his voice calm and steady, utterly devoid of judgment. "I'm Ely Napier." He extended a hand toward my father. "We've been watching the county line for 8 years now, waiting for families like yours." My father just stared at the offered hand like he couldn't grasp its meaning. It had been less than 24 hours, but the concept of human kindness, of unsolicited aid, felt like an alien language. His face was rigid, his jaw working as he tried to form a response, but no words came out. "We know what you're going through," Ely continued, withdrawing his hand slightly but not retreating. "Every single one of us got thrown out just like you did. Every family you see here lost everything because we threatened the wrong person's power or reputation." He gestured toward the other cars. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. These weren't strangers, they were the Exiled, the people the town had purged and then pretended never existed. Eli smiled, and it was the first genuine smile I had seen in what felt like years. "Welcome to the real community, Wayne," he said, looking past my father to me. The one where people actually help each other instead of stabbing each other in the back. We built something better, about 40 miles from here. He explained they had founded their own town, created their own democracy, and established their own system of justice. Every family the old town threw away had made something better, together. But Ely wasn't done. He leaned in conspiratorially. We're planning something else, too. We've been documenting everything. The rigged votes, the stolen property, the deaths caused by exile. Like Mrs. Henderson, the FBI is building a case right now. The founding families have been committing fraud, theft, and manslaughter for 50 years. He stepped back and looked straight at the van. We're going back, Mr. Davies, he said, his voice hardening with purpose. But not as exiles, as prosecutors. My father finally took Eli's hand and shook it, the action stiff, mechanical, but a connection nonetheless. He still couldn't speak, but his rigid body relaxed infinitesimally. Follow us, Ely said. We've got a place ready for you tonight. Food, clothes, everything you need. You're not alone anymore. The convoy pulled out, and my father slowly, uncertainly, started our beat-up van and followed them down the highway. My mother was still crying, but the sound was different now, quieter, less desperate. I watched the cars ahead of us, overwhelmed by a dizzying sense of hope and terror. Maybe we could survive this, but more importantly, maybe we could fight back. The drive took almost an hour. We turned off the main highway and onto a winding dirt path. When we emerged from the trees, I gasped. It wasn't a refugee camp of tents and trailers, as I had grimly imagined. It was an actual town. Real houses lined paved streets. There was a 2-story school building, a community center larger than anything in our old town except the factory, and streetlights casting a warm glow. Gardens grew in front yards. This place was functioning. This place was real. It was clean, manicured, yet felt genuinely alive in a way the old town's perfect facade never did. The houses weren't extravagant, but they were solid, built not on inherited wealth but on purpose. Ely pulled up to a newer-looking mobile home. He waited as my father turned off the engine. Again, we just sat there, immobilized by shock. My mother was staring out the window, her face stained with tears, but her eyes fixed on the houses. Come on, Ely called, walking up to the door. Let me show you your new place. We climbed out and followed him inside. The mobile home was fully furnished. The fridge was stocked with actual groceries, milk, eggs, bread. Closets held donated clothes, clean and sorted by size. Someone had made up the beds with fresh sheets. My mother walked straight into the kitchen, opened the fridge door, and just stared at the food. The mundane sight of stocked shelves, the absence of want, broke her completely. Her shoulders began to shake, and a sound erupted from her chest, a release of pure, overwhelming relief. She turned and looked at Ely, tears streaming down her face. Why are you helping us? She asked, the question laced with years of conditioning that said kindness was always transactional. You don't even know us. Eli simply smiled. Because people helped us when we were exiled, and before that, people helped them. That's how this works. We take care of each other because nobody else will. My father walked over to the couch and sat down heavily. He didn't speak, but he put his face in his hands, his entire body rigid. I stood in the middle of the living room, feeling like a ghost. The utter unsolicited kindness was almost as traumatic as the cruelty we had just escaped. Get some rest tonight, Ely advised. Tomorrow morning I'll bring my son Rodrigo over to meet you. He can show you around. He looked directly at me. You're not the only teenagers here who've been through this. After Ely left, the heavy silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of exhaustion, not despair. My mother, in a sudden burst of purpose, started unpacking the trash bags of clothes, hanging them in the closets. My father remained on the couch, staring at nothing. I went into my small bedroom and lay down on the clean, soft bed. Through the thin walls I could hear my mother's quiet, continuous sobs. My father's silence was still the worst. He had simply shut down. I stared at the ceiling and, for the first time in years, let myself remember the day Ben left. I pictured his wave and my resulting shame. I had been 13 and paralyzed by fear, ducking away instead of offering a single gesture of farewell. Now I was 17, lying in a stranger's bed, exiled just like him. And I still didn't know if I could be brave when it truly mattered. The memory of my cowardice, that passive failure, crashed over me again and again. What if exile hadn't changed anything about who I really was? I listened to my parents' broken grief and wondered if any of us would ever feel whole again. The next morning, Eli brought his son Rodrigo and a girl named Thea, offering me a path into this impossible new world. I was still operating on pure survival instinct, my brain foggy with trauma. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee and staring at the window, still lost in the quiet fog of grief. My father had already left with Eli to look at some sort of construction project, Eli having insisted that physical work was the quickest way for a newly exiled man to regain a sense of purpose. When Eli introduced his son, Rodrigo, I barely registered his face. He was about my age, maybe a year younger, with easy laughter and an immediate, non-judgmental understanding in his eyes. The girl was named Thea Harvey. She had dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, wore faded jeans with holes in the knees, and smiled when she saw my confused and exhausted expression. She looked like a regular teenager, not a refugee. "Welcome to the land of the rejects," Thea said, her voice dry but not unkind. "Rodrigo and I are here to give you the grand tour. It mostly consists of pointing out the one school building and the one community center." I managed a weak nod, pulling on a jacket. I was relieved my parents weren't making me stay, and even more relieved to be out of the mobile home where the atmosphere felt thick and heavy with unexpressed pain. The morning air was crisp and cold as we walked down the paved street. Thea talked fast, pointing out the essentials. "That's the community center, where everything happens. Meetings, classes, community meals. You'll be going to the school starting tomorrow. Don't worry. The teachers actually care about if you graduate here." She joked about the exile town lacking a movie theater and a mall, but she added, "The upside is, nobody here is pretending to be perfect. If you have cancer, you get medical treatment. If you get pregnant, you get support. Simple stuff, really." I finally asked why her family had been exiled. Thea didn't flinch. "My mom got pregnant outside of marriage. That's what the old town called a moral failure that could poison the moral foundation of the youth." She laughed, but the sound was brittle and sharp. "It was probably the best thing that ever happened to us, honestly. She had my little brother, who's almost 2 now, and she met someone here who actually wanted to be a father to him, instead of shaming her for having a life." We sat down on a bench outside the community center. For the first time, I felt compelled to share my story with someone who wouldn't judge me. I told her about my father's promotion and how that minor success had been interpreted as a major threat by the founding families. Thea nodded like she understood the playbook completely. She paused for a long time, chewing on her lip, watching a group of younger kids playing near the school. Then she said something that fundamentally shifted the way I saw my own trauma. "You know, Wayne, maybe getting exiled saved us from turning into the kind of people who stayed in that town. The kind who watched families get destroyed and did nothing. I had always viewed the exile as a punishment, a total loss. I had never considered it as a kind of salvation." She was suggesting that the people who remained, those neighbors who ducked their heads and closed their curtains, were the truly damaged ones, poisoned by their own fear and complicity. My shame suddenly felt less absolute. We talked for hours, comparing notes on the horrors of the old town. She remembered when the Hendersons were exiled for marijuana and how Mrs. Henderson died 2 weeks later. She said everyone knew the votes were fake, that the founding families were immune, but no one dared speak. "Fear makes people into cowards," she stated simply. "And the old town ran on fear. That's why we're here." Being around Thea was strange. She wasn't destroyed by what happened to her family. She was scarred, yes, but she was resilient, almost happy here in this genuine, makeshift place. That confused me because I still felt hollowed out and lost. After a lunch provided by the community center, simple sandwiches and soup, Rodrigo took me to meet Bridget Science, who ran the Exile Community School. She was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and kind, discerning eyes. She sat with me in her small, crowded office and asked about my grades and my path. I explained that I was supposed to be a senior and that I desperately needed to graduate on time. I worried that falling behind would mean total failure. Bridget smiled reassuringly. "That won't be a problem, Wayne. The school is small, only about 30 students, but the teachers actually care about helping you learn." She promised to keep me on track for a spring graduation. The relief was physical, a tightening knot finally loosening in my chest. Bridget then looked at me carefully. "Are you okay?" she asked. I mumbled, "I'm fine." It was a reflexive, automatic lie. She didn't push. She simply said, "It's normal to feel numb, disconnected, and distracted after exile. Having structure and routine will help your brain process everything you've lost." I nodded, trying to believe that routine could outfight total devastation. That afternoon, I found my father at a construction site on the edge of the town. He was helping build a new house, hammering nails into boards with a rhythmic mechanical precision. Eli was supervising the work. Eli came over and explained that he kept new exiles busy with physical work. "It gives them something to focus on besides the loss and the anger," he said quietly. "Your father needs purpose right now, even if it's just basic labor." I watched my father work. He wasn't trying to build something great. He was just trying to survive each day without falling apart completely. The repetitive motion of the hammer was a protective shield against his mind. I wanted to talk to him, to tell him I was sorry for everything, but I didn't know what words to use. He didn't even look up. I just stood there watching for a while, a ghost observing another ghost, before walking back to the mobile home. 2 weeks passed in a blur of small classes and trying to focus on homework. I sat with Thea every day at lunch, and gradually, the numbness began to recede, replaced by a dull, constant ache. But my mother was slipping deeper into depression. She spent most of her time staring at nothing, unable to connect with the community's support. She barely ate. One morning, I finally gathered the courage to ask Eli about my sister Maya. She was still in the mental health facility near the old town, isolated and likely believing we had abandoned her, too. I explained my terror that she thought we had left her behind like everyone else did. Eli listened, his expression grave, and then made some calls. He confirmed that Maya had been asking about us constantly. With the help of Rosa, another exiled woman who specialized in logistics, Eli arranged a phone call for that afternoon. Hearing my sister's voice on the phone, thin and scared, broke something open in my chest. She sounded lost. She kept asking if we were coming back for her. I tried to explain about the exile in the new town, but she wasn't listening. She only understood one thing: we were gone. My mother took the phone and talked to Maya for nearly an hour. When she finally hung up, she looked worse than before. The guilt of leaving Maya behind, compounded by the system's cruelty, was eating her alive. My mother became obsessed with getting Maya transferred to a facility closer to the exile town so we could visit her regularly. Rosa warned us it would be difficult and expensive since we had no money or insurance now. The helplessness of not being able to help my sister became a new, devastating burden for my mother. I watched her retreat further into the darkness, the resilience Eli's help had temporarily provided slowly draining away. Dad was still working construction, too tired to deal with her breakdown. I felt stuck between them, not knowing how to help either one. Rodrigo must have noticed I was struggling. He invited me to hang out with the other exiled teenagers that Saturday. About 15 kids showed up at the community center. They were all surprisingly normal. They joked about homework, talked about crushes, and argued about music. They had all been through the trauma of exile, but they weren't letting it destroy them. Being around them helped me understand that exile didn't have to define everything about who we became. We could still be regular people, despite what had been done to us. This new community was a place where trauma was shared, processed, and ultimately transcended. It was a place where I didn't have to hide. After the initial shock of our exile began to fade, a new focus emerged: getting my sister Maya out of the facility near the old town. My mother was consumed by it. The helplessness she felt at not being able to protect Maya was manifesting as a deeper, more dangerous depression. She barely ate, barely spoke, the weight of the injustice crushing her. I spent my afternoons volunteering for Rosa, the logistical expert in the exile community, helping her research transfer costs and application forms. Rosa was relentless, pushing through the bureaucratic nightmares of insurance companies and hospital systems that wouldn't recognize us without valid addresses or funds. The transfer would cost thousands of dollars we didn't have, but we couldn't just abandon Maya. It was during these weeks that Wallace Holt approached me at the community center. He was the man whose wife, Mrs. Henderson, had died 2 weeks after their exile for lack of cancer treatment. He had a look of quiet, surgical determination in his eyes. "Eli says you're good with patterns," Wallace said, his voice low and gravelly. "I need help with documentation work for the FBI case. We're recording every exiled family story as evidence." The idea terrified me. To relive every moment of fear, every act of cruelty, felt like inviting the panic back in. But this was also a path toward Dad's atonement. My years of passive observance, fueled by fear, could finally be channeled into constructive action. I couldn't change the past, but I could make sure the truth was recorded. Rodrigo, sensing my hesitation, immediately volunteered to sit with me during the interview. "Moral support," he said simply. "We all went through it, Wayne. You don't have to face the memories alone." We went to a small office where Von Tanner, a quiet, efficient man who managed the data, had computers and recording equipment set up. I spent 3 grueling hours telling him everything. I described the night Ben's family was exiled when I was 13 and how I had hidden beneath the window instead of waving goodbye. That confession, saying my cowardice out loud to a stranger, was the hardest part. I talked about watching the Hendersons beg and about Mrs. Henderson's death. I explained Maya's breakdown after John was taken. And finally, I detailed my discovery of the founding family pattern, the calculated way they used the vote as a tool of elimination. Recording it all, knowing that every sentence was being written down as evidence for a federal case, made the corruption real in a new, powerful way. It wasn't just a local horror story. It was a systematic pattern of fraud, theft, and abuse. Vaughn thanked me when we finished, confirming that my testimony about observing the founding family pattern as a teenager was valuable. Rodrigo didn't make me talk about it on the walk back. He simply walked beside me in silence, acknowledging the weight I was carrying. A few days later, Ely brought Agent Sebastian Donovan, the FBI agent leading the case, to the community center to meet key witnesses. Donovan was in his early 40s, serious and professional. He shook my hand and explained exactly how the federal case worked. "We are pursuing charges of fraud, racketeering, theft, and manslaughter against the founding families," he confirmed. He showed me documentation, evidence they had collected over 3 years. He stressed that my testimony about the immunity of the 5 families was crucial, because it proved the systematic, rather than circumstantial, nature of the corruption. For the first time since my own exile, I felt a flicker of hope that was not just about survival, but about Sis justice. The powerful men who destroyed us might actually face consequences. That evening, I overheard my father talking with Wallace Holt on the porch of our mobile home. I stood inside near the door, listening. My father's voice was raw and broken, as he admitted he fantasized about hurting the people who had destroyed everything he had built. Wallace didn't offer platitudes. He said he understood that rage completely. But then he offered a vital distinction. Revenge isn't the goal, Wayne, he said. Justice is the goal. Revenge is quick and makes you feel like them. Justice is slow, it holds them accountable, and it's real and lasting. My father started crying then, a wrenching, deep sound I hadn't heard since the day we were exiled. Wallace didn't try to stop him. He just sat there in silence. It was two broken men processing trauma together, and in that moment I saw my father, not as the shell of a man he had become, but as someone who was fighting his way back. Thea and I started spending more time together. We'd sit and talk about the strange, artificial life we had left behind. One afternoon she asked about my girlfriend from the old town, the one who wouldn't look at me during the exile. I confessed that it still hurt, that someone I loved could turn away so easily when things got hard. Thea reached over and took my hand, her touch grounding and real. My boyfriend did the same thing, she admitted, told me he loved me, then acted like I didn't exist once the exile happened. We bonded over the shared experience of betrayal. Thea looked at me with an intensity that cut through my residual shame. We're better off without people like that, Wayne, she said. People who only stick around when the cost of caring is zero. The exile stripped away all the fake relationships and left only the real ones. I realized she was right. The people here in this humble exile town were genuine. They understood loss in ways that made them more willing to help, not less. That loyalty was worth more than all the shallow, conditional friendships back in the old town. The exile, which felt like the total loss of my identity, was actually the forced shedding of a life built on lies. A month later, Eli called an emergency meeting. A single mother named Jennifer and her 2 kids had just been exiled because she reported safety problems at the founding family's factory. She was a FAR's whistleblower, not a criminal. My stomach twisted with familiar dread. I knew exactly what she and her children were feeling right now. Eli immediately organized a welcoming committee. Before I could overthink it, my hand shot up. I had to go. Rosa began coordinating housing, and my mother, snapping out of her depression for the first time in weeks, started gathering donated clothes and food. 6 of us drove out to the county line that evening, waiting in the same spot where Lee's convoy had waited for us. When Jennifer's beat-up truck appeared, she looked terrified. Her young daughter, Laura, who looked about 12, asked Eli, "Are you going to hurt us?" That question broke my heart because it showed how completely they had been conditioned to expect cruelty from every face. I stepped forward and told them, "We just want to help. We know exactly what you're feeling right now." We led them back to the exile community. I watched Jennifer's face change when she saw the paved streets and real houses. Her young son, Jack, kept asking if the town was real. Rodrigo laughed and said he had asked the exact same thing when his family arrived. We got them settled, and I helped Laura and Jack unpack their garbage bags. Laura was quiet and watchful. I sat down beside her and told her about my own shame, about hiding below the window when Ben waved goodbye 5 years ago. I told her I understood being scared and confused. She looked at me, her eyes wide. "Does it get better?" I said, "Yes, but slowly." The next day, I helped Laura and Jack enroll in Bridget's school. Rodrigo joked that I was already becoming part of the community support system, that I had the right experience to help scared kids adjust. The responsibility felt strange but good. I had been useless and afraid when I was 13. Now, I could actually help Laura and Jack in ways no one could help me back then. I was finally doing something useful instead of just surviving. The cycle of fear and complicity that defined the old town was being replaced here by a cycle of trauma and mutual aid. We were all survivors helping survivors, and that felt like the beginning of real strength. My mother, energized by the purpose of helping Jennifer and the children, began working with Rosa again. Their singular mission, getting Maya transferred. They navigated endless bureaucratic red tape, pooling community donations, working on grant applications, and fighting for hours on the phone. Wallace gave them $50 and said he wished someone had done that for his wife. The generosity of people who had nothing overwhelmed me. Over 6 weeks, through sheer stubborn determination, they secured the approval and the funds for Maya's transfer. The day Rosa called my mother to tell her the transfer was approved and funded, my mother broke down, crying with pure relief. I hugged her, feeling the devastating weight she had been carrying lift from her shoulders. We could finally visit Maya regularly. Our family, though scarred, was beginning to piece itself back together. Our first visit to the new facility, just 20 minutes from the exile community, was hard. Maya was fragile, medicated, and smaller than I remembered. She was still processing the system's cruelty. She kept asking why we didn't come sooner. My mother held her and promised we would never leave her again. Maya looked at me, reaching out a fragile hand. "Are you okay, Wayne?" Even broken and medicated, she was still trying to take care of me. I told her I was surviving and asked how she was doing. She said the medication helped, but she still thought about John. I realized that my sister's healing was tied to the fate of the old town. She needed to know the system that destroyed her life was defeated. I vowed then that the documentation work, the interviews, the testimony, it all had to succeed. It was the only way any of us would ever truly be free. I had spent years hiding the truth, paralyzed by the fear that paralyzed the entire town. But now, the only way to save ourselves and everyone else was to speak it directly to the federal government. 3 months after our own exile, after the emotional breakthrough of getting my sister Maya transferred to a facility near the Exiled community, the FBI case moved into its critical phase. Sebastian Donovan's team required formal, sworn depositions from key witnesses. My testimony about noticing the pattern of corruption when I was 17 was deemed crucial evidence. I was scheduled to go to the federal building in the city. The idea terrified me. This wasn't just talking to Vaughn or Ely. This was being recorded on video, questioned by federal prosecutors, and cross-examined by lawyers who worked for the people who destroyed my family. The pressure was immense. My hands started shaking every time I thought about it. My parents insisted on coming with me, sitting in the lobby for moral support. Rodrigo offered to wait too, giving me a confident fist bump before I went inside. "Go destroy them, Wayne," he said. The federal building was a massive, cold stone structure, a fortress of actual, functioning law, which felt utterly alien after living in a town ruled by manufactured fear. A prosecutor named Michelle, a sharp woman in her 40s with an air of professional competence, met us. She explained the process in a private room. They would ask detailed, specific questions about everything I had witnessed, dating back 5 years. I had to answer honestly and clearly. The deposition room itself felt sterile and oppressive. Cameras were set up, recording equipment was running, and Michelle sat across from me with stacks of evidence binders. The formality of the setting ratcheted up my anxiety to a dizzying level. They started with the basics: my name, my age, my school, how long I'd lived in the old town. Then they moved to the system itself. They asked me to describe the fear, the isolation, and the devastating efficiency of the annual exile. I started slow, my voice cracking slightly when I first began to speak. I described the night Ben's family was chosen when I was 13. I recounted the horror of the crowd stepping away, the sheriff surrounding the house, and the forced packing into trash bags. Michelle guided the questions, focusing on the specific emotional impact of that first exile. She then directed me to the most painful part of my memory, the one I had run from for 5 years. "Mr. Davies," she said, her voice sympathetic but firm. "You mentioned in your preliminary interview that you watched your friend, Ben, load his family's possessions into their van. Can you describe your interaction with him that night?" I swallowed, my mouth instantly dry. I could feel the cameras recording every hesitation, every tremor in my voice. The air in the room seemed to vanish. I remembered the cold glass of the window pane against my forehead, the darkness of my room, the blinding fear. He looked up. I started, the words coming out in a rush, desperate to get them out before I lost my nerve. He looked right at my window and raised his hand. He waved goodbye. Michelle leaned forward slightly. "And what did you do, Wayne?" I took a shaky breath, the shame of that 13-year-old boy crashing over me again, heavy and immediate. This was the moment of my internal climax, the public confrontation of my greatest failure. I looked directly at the camera, addressing the future audience of this evidence, the jury, the judge, the founding families themselves. This was the single terrifying transaction I had been avoiding for 5 years, giving voice to the 13-year-old coward I was. This was the single terrifying transaction I had been avoiding for 5 years, giving voice to the 13-year-old coward I was. This was the single terrifying transaction I had been avoiding for 5 years, giving voice to the 13-year-old coward I was. I ducked, I whispered, but my voice was recorded, magnified by the equipment. I ducked below the window. I didn't wave back. I was too scared to even move my hand. I was terrified that helping or acknowledging a friend meant my family would be chosen next. I didn't cry, but my entire body tensed, rigid with the memory. Describing that passive cowardice out loud, transforming it from a private, burning shame into an official statement for the federal record, was harder than anything I had ever faced. Michelle paused, letting the silence hang. "Why were you scared, Wayne? Why would a simple wave put your family at risk?" I explained the mechanics of the fear. The council leader said, "Anyone caught helping you pack or say goodbye will join you." The sheriff's department was surrounding their home to make sure no one approached. They enforced the isolation. The community's rule was simple: total conformity, total silence, or total destruction. The questions moved on, focusing on the systemic evidence. I described the Hendersons, John's exile, and Maya's subsequent breakdown. Then, the most crucial line of questioning: the pattern. "At what point did you realize the exile system was rigged, not random?" "When I was 17, I answered, my voice stronger now that I was talking about the facts, about the numbers I had meticulously tracked in my notebook. I realized the 5 founding families were completely immune. They were the only ones who never got exiled, despite having teenagers who broke rules or businesses with problems. It wasn't a lottery. It was a calculated purge. Michelle showed me documents, records I hadn't even known existed, confirming the founding family's systematic profit from seized assets. My observations, my fear-driven tracking, was now part of an overwhelming legal structure. The questions continued for 4 hours. When we finally finished, I felt utterly drained, physically and emotionally empty. But there was also a residual, powerful current of satisfaction. I had told the entire truth, including the painful parts. Sebastian Donovan met with me alone afterward. He shook my hand, his expression serious. Your testimony about recognizing the founding family pattern when you were 17 is crucial, Wayne, he repeated. It proves systematic corruption. If a teenager could see the rigging that clearly, the adults definitely knew what was happening and chose to stay silent. He said my age made my testimony even more powerful, because it established how obvious the corruption was. He thanked me for my courage in coming forward. I almost laughed because I still didn't feel courageous. I felt like I was finally making up for years of fear. Courage isn't about never being scared, Sebastian said, as if reading my mind. It's about doing the right thing despite the fear. I walked out of the federal building and into the sunlight, feeling something new and unfamiliar. There's pride. I was still the same boy who hid under a window, but I had finally chosen to stand up when it mattered. Rodrigo gave me a huge grin and a fist bump. My parents, who had waited patiently in the lobby, looked at me with open relief and respect. On the drive home, my father, who had been emotionally distant since the exile, reached across the seat and placed a hand on my shoulder. I'm impressed, Wayne, he said, his voice husky. You handled that with dignity. It was the first genuine compliment he had given me since our world fell apart, and it meant more than the prosecutor's praise. My mother squeezed my hand from the passenger seat. We drove back to the exile community in silence, but it was a silence filled for the first time with hope. The shame was gone, replaced by a cold, righteous anger that I carried like a shield into the courtroom. The arrests had already happened. The 5 founding family leaders had been taken into federal custody a few weeks prior. The sight of them in handcuffs making national news and sending a tremor of shocked vindication through the exile community. But the trial was the real fight, the moment where the truth had to defeat their expensive legal defenses. The day of the hearing, the courthouse was a massive stone structure that felt like the antithesis of our small, fearful town. We parked the same beat-up van, now running a little smoother thanks to my father's tinkering, and walked toward the entrance. That's when I saw them, the founding family leaders, standing with their suits and lawyers on the courthouse steps. They looked older, perhaps, but still carried themselves with the arrogance of men who expected to win. One of them glanced my way, his eyes cold and dismissive. My hands began to shake, but he instantly grabbed my arm and squeezed it hard, grounding me. Rodrigo moved closer on my other side. We walked past them without looking back. My parents found seats in the gallery. My mother was pale with terror, but my father's jaw was clenched tight, a look of grim determination replacing his usual quiet despair. I was led to the witness room, and after one final prep session with the prosecutor, Michelle, I heard my name called. I walked into the courtroom on legs that felt barely connected to my body. The judge sat high above, looking down on the proceedings. The jury box was full of ordinary people, staring at me with solemn curiosity. The 5 founding family leaders sat at the defense table, whispering conspiratorially with their 3 lawyers. I took the witness stand and swore my oath, my voice cracking slightly. Michelle started easy, confirming my identity and background. Then she moved straight to the core of the pattern. She asked me to describe how the system worked and what happened to people like the Hendersons, who were exiled for their son smoking marijuana, and my sister's boyfriend, John, who was exiled for his father gambling online. Then she asked the central question, Mr. Davies, based on your observations over 5 years, what pattern did you notice regarding who was and was not exiled? I looked right at the founding family leaders, sitting smugly at the defense table, and spoke clearly. They never got exiled, not once in 50 years. They owned the town, they sat on the council, they controlled the businesses, and they were immune. Everyone else was removed for small, arbitrary things, but the families who controlled the vote were never touched. The defense lawyers objected immediately, claiming the testimony was conjecture and speculation, but the judge overruled them, telling me to continue. I explained how they controlled the ballot box, counted the votes in private, and announced the results without any way for the public to verify them. I recounted the story of my father's promotion, merit-threatening power, and our subsequent exile 3 months later. Michelle presented my documents, the careful notes I'd kept in my notebook, alongside the FBI's compiled records, visually demonstrating the systematic pattern of competitors being purged. The defense lawyer, an older man in an expensive gray suit, stood for cross-examination. He looked at me with disdain. Mr. Davies, he drawled, isn't it true that you are profoundly bitter about losing your home and your privileged life in that town? Yes, I said. I am bitter. And isn't it true that what you truly desire here is not justice, but their revenge against the men you blame for your misfortune? I want us justice, I repeated, meeting his gaze. Justice means accountability for 50 years of fraud and theft. He tried to rattle me, to paint me as an angry, unstable teenager making up conspiracy theories. But every time he pushed, I pointed back to the evidence, the vote records, the confiscated properties, and the undeniable fact that the founders were the only group consistently exempt from a system they claimed was democratic. He even tried to dismiss my intelligence. You were only 17, Mr. Davies. How could you possibly understand the complexities of community governance? The judge, who had been watching the proceedings with increasing agitation, actually interrupted the defense lawyer. Counselor, the judge said, his voice sharp with command. A teenager who could track systematic corruption for 5 years and identify the core structural flaw clearly understood plenty. Ask a relevant question. The defense lawyer, thoroughly chastened, sat down, looking defeated. Michelle asked me one final question. Wayne, based on everything you witnessed and documented, do you believe the exile system was fair and democratic? No, I said, the word ringing out in the courtroom. It was a rigged selection process disguised as voting, designed specifically to remove anyone who threatened the founding family's economic and social control. I was dismissed and walked back to my seat, my legs shaking violently, but my head held high. I had done it. I had spoken the complete, painful truth in the presence of the men who tried to silence me. Thea immediately grabbed my hand, her fingers tight around mine. My parents were crying in the gallery, but these were tears of pride. The next witness was Wallace Holt. The prosecutor asked him to describe what happened to his family. Wallace walked to the stand with a terrifying calmness. He explained how he was exiled 8 years ago for his teenage son's minor offense. He explained how his wife, who had stage 3 cancer, lost access to the only available hospital and treatment when they were driven out. The courtroom fell utterly silent as Wallace described the last 2 weeks of his wife's life. He talked about driving 3 states away, finding a charity ward, and watching her deteriorate rapidly without proper care. I held her hand when she died, Wallace said, his voice finally cracking, 2 weeks after exile. Because they took everything from us. The defense lawyers objected, claiming the exile itself was legal, and they were not responsible for what happened after families left town. They actually argued that the health outcomes were not their concern. The judge slammed his gavel down, his face going hard with fury. He ordered the defense to sit down. Wallace looked directly at the 5 founding family leaders. Your legal system, he stated, his voice now a steady, cold declaration, murdered my wife. As surely as if you had pulled the trigger. The defense had no defense against that moral indictment. They could not spin away the truth of a woman's death, tied directly to their greed. The faces of the jury members confirmed it. Their verdict was already being written. Over the next several weeks, other exiled families testified, each story building an insurmountable wall of evidence. A factory worker exiled after reporting safety violations. A teacher removed for questioning the budget. Store owners targeted because they competed with founding family shops. The prosecutors presented evidence of falsified ballots, email chains discussing which families to target next, and bank records proving they profited from the seized property. My father testified on a Tuesday morning. He described his promotion and the supervisor who warned him the day before the vote. You should have known better than to take a job a founding family wanted. My father was no longer broken. He stood up to them, telling the clear, undeniable truth of their motives. The defense called witnesses from the old town, remaining residents who claimed the system was fair and democratic. But under cross-examination, their testimony collapsed. The prosecutor asked each one if they had ever verified the vote totals or questioned why the founding families were always immune. They all admitted the same thing they had noticed, but they had said nothing. The prosecutor exposed their complicity, showing how the entire town enabled the corruption through willful, self-serving ignorance. 7 months after our own exile, the jury came back. The verdict, res guilties on every charge. Racketeering, fraud, theft, and manslaughter. The courtroom erupted in a wave of relieved, quiet sobs and applause from the exiled families. My mother grabbed my father, and they held each other, shaking with disbelief. Thea was crying next to me, and Rodrigo had a triumphant, unrestrained grin on his face. The founding family leaders sat frozen, their empires collapsing around them. The judge's sentencing remarks were brutal. He called the exile system a systematic violation of civil rights disguised as democracy, and sentenced the council leader to 25 years in federal prison, with the others receiving 15 to 20 years each. Crucially, he ordered full Rs restitution of all property seized from exiled families over 50 years. It wasn't perfect justice. Nothing could bring back Wallace's wife or undo my sister's trauma. But it was real. The people who destroyed us were going to prison for decades, and the wealth they built on our stolen lives would be returned. We had fought back, and we had won accountability. The convictions weren't an ending. They were the foundation for everything we had to build next. The court victory didn't automatically erase the trauma, but it removed the paralyzing threat. The founding families were gone, sentenced to decades in prison. The entire corrupt system in the old town was immediately dissolved. The remaining council members resigned in disgrace. Full restitution was ordered, the legal process of seizing the founders' businesses and returning the stolen assets to the exiled families beginning immediately. Most families, including mine, chose not to return to the old town. It was too poisoned by the fear and complicity we had witnessed. The community we built, forged in shared trauma and mutual aid, was genuinely better. My family received our restitution check on a Thursday afternoon. The amount wasn't the full value of everything they had taken, but it was substantial, enough to start rebuilding financially, enough to provide true security. My father opened the envelope, stared at the number, and then simply started to cry. It wasn't the broken despair from the night of our exile. It was the overwhelming, uncontrollable release of a man who had survived, fought back, and won. My mother, now invigorated, immediately called my sister's treatment facility to arrange better care options, programs Maya desperately needed, but that our poverty had kept out of reach. Now, we could actually afford the healing. I suggested we invest a portion of the money directly into the exile community's development. This place had saved us when we had nothing. It deserved our loyalty and resources. I finished my senior year at the Exile Community School that May. The graduation ceremony was small, held in the community center gymnasium, but it was the most meaningful graduation I could imagine. About 30 of us walked across the makeshift stage. My parents sat in the front row, and between them sat Maya. She looked tired but stable, her medication keeping her steady enough to sit through the ceremony. Rodrigo walked first, then Thea, then me. Bridget, the school principal, handed me my diploma and hugged me tight. She gave a short speech about how we had all survived something that should have destroyed us, and now we were stronger than most people would ever be. My mother cried soft tears of relief. My father put his arm around her, and Maya reached over and took my mother's hand. Watching them sit together like that, supporting each other instead of falling apart, was the final proof that we had made it through the worst. Thea kissed me in front of everyone and Maya smiled. A real, genuine smile, for the first time in months. On the drive home, we were in the same beat-up van the old town had given us. My father had spent the last year fixing it up, replacing the transmission, painting over the rust. It ran smooth now, a symbol of our own repair. Thea came over the next evening. We sat on the porch, discussing the fall semester. She had been accepted to the community college 20 minutes away, the same school Rodrigo and I planned to attend. Her parents had encouraged her to apply to bigger, farther schools, but she had refused. No, she told them. This place saved us. We're not abandoning it now that things are getting better. We're staying to help make it stronger. Rodrigo showed up later with pizza. We ate on the porch and joked about being the exile community's second generation. The kids who grew up here instead of just arriving broken. Rodrigo said we had a responsibility to ensure nothing like the old town system ever happened again. Thea suggested starting a nonprofit to document similar exile systems in other places and help families fight back. My father, who had found his purpose in structure and meritocracy again, got hired as a supervisor at a manufacturing plant 30 minutes north in the city. The job paid better than his old position, and the company promoted based on merit, not family name. He came home with cautious pride on his face. My mother hugged him hard. They were rebuilding their lives and their relationship, no longer broken, but genuinely strong. My mother started going to community organizing meetings 3 times a week. She helped coordinate support for newly arrived families, ensuring they had food and someone to talk to who understood. She was working with Rosa on advocacy projects, pushing for laws that would prevent new exile systems from forming. The depression that had nearly consumed her was replaced by the fierce, focused purpose of mutual aid. She wasn't the same person she was before the exile, but this new version was stronger, grounded in reality instead of maintaining false appearances. Maya was discharged from residential treatment in June and moved into a supervised apartment 10 minutes from our new house, which we bought with the restitution money and my father's income. She got a part-time job at the community center, filing and answering phones 4 hours a day. She was still fragile. She still had bad days where she couldn't handle being around people, and panic attacks sometimes hit at night. But she was actively rebuilding her life. She came over for dinner one Sunday and told me she was seeing someone from her support group, a kind man dealing with his own trauma. Watching her take that risk, after everything she endured with John, made me profoundly happy for her. She deserved normal, sweet happiness. Wallace Holt started a foundation in his wife's name to help exiled families access medical care and legal support. The foundation office was a small room in the community center, but it was functional. I volunteered to help with fundraising and outreach. Wallace told me that channeling his grief into helping others was the only thing that made his wife's death feel less meaningless. I finally understood what he meant. Trauma could either destroy you completely or become fuel for making sure it didn't happen to other people. Agent Donovan visited the Exile community in July for a final meeting with everyone who contributed. He walked over to me specifically and shook my hand. He reiterated that my testimony about recognizing the founding family pattern when I was 17 was crucial evidence of systematic corruption. If a teenager could see the rigging that clearly, he said, the adults definitely knew what was happening. I felt genuinely proud, for the first time since our exile, like I had contributed something meaningful to justice. A year after our exile, Li handed me a folded piece of paper. My best friend's family, Ben's family, had reached out through the Exile network. They had been living 3 states away, working in a warehouse district, and had no idea about the FBI investigation or the convictions. I stared at the number for 10 minutes before I could make myself dial. My hands shook so badly. When Ben answered, his voice sounded exactly the same, but exhausted. We were both 18 now, but the last time we truly spoke, we were 13. I apologized immediately for hiding below the window that night. The words came out in a rush, desperate and sincere. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Wayne, we were just kids in an impossible situation. I forgave you years ago. I understood fear better than anyone. We talked for 2 hours. They arranged to visit the Exile community 2 weeks later. Seeing Ben get out of their car was overwhelming. We hugged for a long time. His family decided to move to the Exile community. They said returning to the old town, even with restitution money, felt like torture. I helped them find a house and get furniture donated. Rodrigo and I helped his younger sister enroll in the school. The cycle of mutual aid continued. This is what real community looked like. We all ate dinner together on the back porch of the house my parents bought. My sister was there with her partner laughing. Thea joined us. Ben and his family came over. We talked about the future college plans, career goals, and the continued growth of the community. Normal conversations that families have when they are no longer traumatized and desperate. I looked around at everyone and realized we had actually healed. Not perfectly. My sister still had her medication and therapy. My father still had nightmares about losing everything. I still carried the shame of hiding from Ben's wave. But we were healing instead of just surviving. We had built real lives, forged in fire, with people who actually cared about each other. I'm 20 years old now, working part-time at Wallace's Foundation while finishing my degree in social work. I've learned that justice isn't about revenge or perfect endings. The founding families are in prison. The exile system is destroyed. We built a community based on actual mutual support, not fear. I will always carry the shame of ducking below that window, a memory of cowardice I can't erase. But I turned that cowardice into courage when it mattered most. I testified in court. I helped document the abuse. I stood up to the people who destroyed us. We survived systematic cruelty, fought back, won real accountability, and built a future where people actually help each other. That's not a perfect ending, but it's a real one, and it's ours.